Hello and welcome to our special series, Decade of Disinformation, here on Boom. It's a series of conversations, and today we're kicking off with a treat. We're joined by two very special people across different time zones. We have Claire Wardle joining us from First Draft, which really gave us a language for this problem of fake news all those many years ago. Claire, good morning, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And we also have Masato Kajimoto of Hong Kong University. He joins us from Hong Kong. He's one of the leaders of the media literacy movement across the world. And for him, it's 8:30 p.m., I believe. Good evening, Masato.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
We're very, very excited to have this conversation. And we probably have, 4 or 5 questions, but we're looking at the big picture here. And we're calling this Decade of Disinformation because we believe that it's the rise of social media, the availability of smartphones, possibly the rise of populism across the world in many geographies, which sort of came together and created the conditions for disinformation, whatever version we're calling it right now. I don't know if that is quite the exact way of putting it. That's why I'm going to ask my first question, Claire, to you. Where does this modern and contemporary form of disinformation really spring from, and when did it begin?
Well, I think you're right to emphasize that there are many different reasons why we're in the moment that we're in. Ultimately, misinformation, rumors, gossip, falsehoods, as you said, it's not new. But what's really kickfired this is ultimately the fact that you can create this content in seconds for no money, and you can spread it around the world in seconds for similarly very little money. And so those two forces have come together. Then ultimately, as you've said, the last 10, 20 years have been 2 decades of real change globally. And so many people feel more unsettled. Financially, they feel less settled. That's before we have the pandemic. But you're right to point out, in many countries, the rise of populism. There's been some really major shifts over the last 20 years. And because of that, the social networks submerged in the middle of the 2000s, whatever we call that decade. And so all of these things came together. And I think we have to recognize the complexity. There's not one reason why we're here today. There are many.
Indeed. And we're going to take that a little forward. We apologize if there's been an outage here, but Masato, as long as we're all here and we're listening to these questions, the terms we now have, Masato, are they the correct terms? Have we diagnosed the problem? In other words, correctly? We're familiar with terms like information disorder and information pollution and disinformation and misinformation. Do you think 5 or 7 or 10 or 15 years down the line, we've actually diagnosed the problem correctly?
I'm not quite sure. Because, word is just word, right? Like take the term fake news. It's very popular. Everybody understands fake news, but they understand the word in different ways. So in different culture, fake news or misinformation, disinformation can be translated into different words as well. So it's really hard to answer that question. But for me, is Claire gone? Oh, anyway, to me, ultimately, what is important is for I'm from media literacy and news literacy. So for me, important thing is for each news consumer or each information consumer to understand what it means to have misinformation and disinformation being fed to their own sort of media diet. I think that realization that what I'm consuming might contain disinformation, misinformation, whatever that means, I think that awareness alone is something that we should value. I don't know if that answers your question.
Got it. This is something that I want to take forward a little bit with Claire as well, but I want to focus on the very basic specifics right now. Claire, there are many ways we can look at misinformation, disinformation, information disorder, and we think of solutions. And some of the solutions are fact-checking, sometimes it's media literacy. I want to proceed case by case. So far, what does the research tell us? Does fact-checking work? Is it effective?
So I would say over the last 4 years, when we've had the most conversations about this, our responses have been very much on the kind of reactive level. So let's really invest in fact-checking. And fact-checking is an incredibly important resource. We need to have an accurate record, and that's why it's extraordinary to see so many new fact-checkers around the world. When people say, does fact-checking work? What they often mean is, does it change people's minds? And we know pretty well from the research that it's very difficult to change people's minds. And it doesn't matter how well educated you are. It doesn't matter if you're from the left or the right. All of those things don't really matter. It's a very human thing to believe a particular worldview. So what the research is starting to show us is that we should be doing more work before people see falsehoods. So work around, for example, inoculation theory, which means the more you train people to understand the tactics and the techniques that are used by bad actors or those pushing disinformation, the more effective it is. And people are actually very good at spotting these examples in the wild. Or examples like pre-bunking, which is to say, we're seeing the rollout of the new COVID vaccine. It's very likely you're going to see memes of Bill Gates with horns. This is why. This is why people are trying to undermine Bill Gates. So those kind of ideas of talking to people before they see it are actually very, very good. And in the same way as media literacy, that's part and parcel of that. I would like to see that kind of work baked into information, digital literacy, media literacy, to say, how can we give people the tools to identify it, rather than when they see it, tell them how to check it, because actually that's a much harder way of getting people to think about information.
Right. Masato, Claire used the term inoculation, and when I think of media literacy, I think of it as vaccination. I think of it as prevention. I think of fact-checking sometimes as the cure. Now, I'm sure there are major problems with this analogy, but to an extent, it is useful. What would you say is the role of media literacy would be like? Are there limits to it? Because I've read research saying that media literacy does work and it doesn't work, both.
Well, it really depends on what you teach and what your goals are. So take fact-checking, for example. I teach fact-checking courses at my university, and my goal is not to have students fact-check things and give it to the public so that they might change their mind. My primary goal is to train my students for the future so that they know, every single student in my class knows how to verify information, how to fact check things, and how to sort of learn, how to sort of like, the skills that I want to try to teach is for students to sort of smell the dodgy content. They don't really know if it's true or not. They don't jump into conclusion because they are slightly skeptical towards, like, let's say, for example, seeing is no longer believing. Right, my background here is a virtual background, and it's completely fake. And I think that kind of teaching, so including fact-checking, social media verification into media literacy education, certainly in my observational research, it works. But what one teacher can do is very limited. So I would like to see many countries actually formally incorporating fact-checking and other skills that Claire talked about into like public school education. You have to start early. And I think that's the idea of inoculation, right? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that brings several other further follow-up questions, but we're running short of time. I want to make sure that we get in all the topics we wanted to discuss. So Claire, I'm going to toss this one to you. When we speak about dealing with misinformation, disinformation, information disorder, whatever we call it, we have to speak about the technology companies. And my question to you is, do you see a situation playing out in the future that technology companies will actually redesign incentives and possibly will change their own incentives?
This is the big question. I mean, ultimately, because of the kind of companies they are, every single quarter they have to make more profit. So it's not just they have to be profitable. Every quarter they have to make more money. So the idea that the incentive structure would change enough for them to make the changes that they need to do, I'm really not sure, unless there's such a call from society to say, we don't want this kind of content on these sites and we're going to stop using your sites. But the reason these platforms are so addictive is because we as humans are weak we love rumor and gossip and sensationalism. So that's partly why we're in this mess. I hope that that we see governments think about ways of putting pressure on these platforms that's not just about fines, because I worry if we do that, they're going to take down too much speech. But I'd like to see the design of things like more friction, make it harder for me to be addicted, make it harder for me to share false information if I haven't read it. And we're starting to see a bit more of that. Twitter in particular this year has done more to try and test out some of these interventions. So let's see, but I don't think they're fundamentally going to change the incentives and the profit structure. But I do think that government pressure might force them to think more innovatively about different forms of friction.
And speaking of government pressure, Masato, you're familiar with a lot of cases in Asia. Not all governments are, pro a situation where we have safe speech in the country. Sometimes governments are the source of these massive misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So do you see, again, big picture, do you see any way this is going to end? I mean, from my perspective, I believe that governments will continue to use these tools. And, I don't really see a way out. I'm being pessimistic, but maybe there is another perspective, Masato.
I can't really predict the future, but I think one of the reasons why we are in this mess is, which I think Claire didn't mention in the first question, is the internet advertising, right? There is a strong incentive for many players to use the platform to make, clickbaity headlines and whatnot. So that's one of the reasons why we are seeing so much misinformation on the platforms. So in Asia, when we have this kind of problem, it's always top down. We always say, well, government should do something. And as you said, Venkatesh, our governments in this region tend to be, okay, why don't we regulate the speech? So that's, and also there are so many government agencies now that are now having fact-checking projects. Indian government has one, Indonesian government has one, Singapore government has one, Thai government has one, so Philippines thinking about it. So many governments here are actually spending resources to fact-check information. And it's great if it's public health issues, but when it comes to political issues, obviously they don't care about the opposing sides. So it gets very political. So I would say if something could change top-down in Asia, it's the regulation on internet advertising, not speech. That I don't know if that happened, but there are some efforts in that direction too. So for example, if you're sending a political advertisement, your server has to be located in your country and that kind of regulation. But obviously there is also prone to abuse. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. I mean, speaking of, those are tough questions. And speaking of tough questions with very few answers, let me ask the ultimate tough question as we round it off. I want to do a quick game afterwards if there's time. But my question is, we saw the end of spam as a problem. Several decades before, we spoke about population and not being able to feed the world's hungry. We managed to lick that problem. So do you believe then, I'm going to start with you, Claire, and I'd like you, Masato, to join in as well after she finishes. Do you believe that we're going to see the end of misinformation or the end of disinformation anytime soon?
No. And I don't think we'll ever see the end of it, actually, because spam, I think probably everybody on the planet could say, I don't want that email when somebody is trying to sell me something that I don't want. But misinformation, there might be pieces of misinformation that I struggle with. I don't think it's a good idea that it's out there. I worry about harm on society. But there could be a number of other people who think it's important that we have that speech. And fundamentally, I'm always going to say that we should have freedom of expression, more speech. And so the only way that we would stop misinformation is if we all agreed that there was somebody or some agency with all the power to say, yes, no, 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 yes, yes, yes. And I don't think any of us want that on the planet. So I feel like misinformation, disinformation is problematic. We're going to have to struggle with it, but I don't think we're ever going to see an end to it. And fundamentally, I think that's okay, because I think if we were, that would bring its own problems, and we have to think very seriously about that.
Okay, Masato?
Yeah, I agree completely. And then this is where the analogy to medical science works really well. We call content viral for a reason. It acts like a virus. And it's silly for us to try to eradicate all the viruses out there in the world, right? So once in a while we catch cold. Once in a while we get really sick. Once in a while we see pandemics. But what we are trying to do is to try to attenuate the impact of outbreaks when it happens, right? We are trying to immunize ourselves as much as we can. And I think that's what you can do at most. I mean, there is no way we can eradicate misinformation and disinformation. It's going to be with us forever. So what we can do is to be a bit more, resilient towards that.
Yeah, anyone hoping for easy and quick answers will probably be disappointed when we ask these big questions. And before we wrap up, I want to play a quick game. I'm going to toss a few terms. We'll again start with you, Claire, and then Masato for each term. And please tell me if it's useful, if it's underrated, if it's overrated. So my first term is the most popular one. We all use it. It's fake news.
It still has to go. It's the worst phrase. I can explain.
Yes, I agree. It's dangerous, but I don't think it's going to go.
It's being used in such a way across the world that if I ask people what's fake news, they say BBC, CNN, boom.
Right.
Like it's not helping us. We're using a term that's actually used against a free and independent media, and it gets worse every single year. So we just have to stop using it. I cannot be more passionate about this.
Yeah.
So it's not useful. It's neither overrated nor underrated.
It's harmful. It's not that it's not useful. It's harmful.
It's harmful. Okay, Masato, what would you say?
Yeah, I agree. And disappointed. I mean, the sad thing is that now the word from fake news to fact checking. I mean, in Asia, fact checking is now very political. So government says, "Oh, we fact checked opposition. They are lying." Or we fact checked this media. They are lying. So even fact checking the word is politicized in Asia, and many governments are using that like, fake news. So it's very dangerous, but I don't see the end of it. Yeah, people will keep using it. If fake news, the word is gone, they will find some other word to attack the media.
All right. The next word that I want to put out there is alternative facts. Clear?
Not useful, and I would say also harmful.
Okay, Masato?
I don't even know how to translate that into different Asian languages. I don't know how alternative facts, the idea will fly in different cultures in here. But in English, it makes no sense to me.
Yeah. Here at Boom, we always say there are no alternative facts, they're just facts. Finally, this is one word that I kind of have trouble with explaining, rather. I understand what it is, but I don't know how useful it is. The word or the term is post-truth.
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly helpful because I think there's this idea that we've lost and that there is no truth. Unfortunately, the term truth has been weaponized. If you actually search for truth online, it's used by conspiracy theorists like, we'll tell you the truth. So we do have to be careful about language, but I think post-truth makes me just depressed. It's not that bad yet. I really believe that there's still hope.
Masato?
Yeah, the same here. I mean, I think I don't even know where the word comes from, but postmodernism was the same idea, right? Everything is sort of constructed in our brain, and nothing is objectively true. So the idea probably comes from there, and I don't think it's helping a lot. But when I teach my course, I'd say there's one fact, but there are different ways to interpret facts. That's where people disagree, right? And that's where people cannot really tell the difference between opinions and interpretation from pure facts. Let's say scientific facts, for example. So it's a tough road ahead. Yeah.
Right. And finally, last set of terms: disinformation and misinformation. Claire?
Yeah, as somebody who really pushed definitions in 2017, I should still love them. But I worry a little bit that mis and disinformation is this focus on false and misleading content that causes harm. And actually, increasingly, what I'm seeing is that people really believe this kind of content And it's about narratives warping reality. So I sometimes think when I'm writing, I don't think these terms really capture what's happening anymore. And so, Russia meddling in the US election in 2016, that was a disinformation campaign. But seeing the way that people are conflating anti-masks, excessive quarantine, anti-vax, I see all of this and I just think, I don't know what this is anymore. It's something very different. So I think in 2021, we need to step away from this idea that each individual piece of content can be misinformation or disinformation, and to say what's going on here, because it's something much bigger, I think, and those terms fail to capture that.
Yes, and when we do trainings as well, we face this challenge of how you can go on categorizing terms, and there's no end to the definitions. Masato, I'm going to give the last word on this to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I agree with Claire completely. When I teach, I no longer differentiate misinformation and disinformation, and I have this huge circle just as information. And misinformation and disinformation just a small circle within the big circle, because when people consume information through the internet, they don't really differentiate each piece of information like that, right? So here's big information you're consuming every day, and it's a lot. Information overload is one of the core cause of this problem. So let's find a way to deal with this information overload. That's how I sort of define this. And also, tricky part of disinformation is that once you start telling students that you have to think about motivation, they will really second guess the motivation. Oh, this journalist has this particular motive to do this. Oh, they have hidden agenda. So it's not going to help students either. Yeah, so yeah, I think definition itself is already very academic and pedantic. So I think definitely that's not the way we should start this conversation, especially with the younger kids. Yeah.
Understood. We leave it at that. We can go on talking about this, but Masato, Claire, thanks so much. You've given us a lot of perspective, a lot of things for me to unpack again as I go back to the basics, which I do every now and then. Thanks so much. Good day to both of you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Bye.